All right. Well, the first Sunday of Lent, here we are. And today, we have a really very familiar passage, the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness. So, Jesus is led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. And when he had fasted 40 days and 40 nights, afterward he was hungry. Probably an understatement. Now, when the tempter came to him, he said, "If you are the Son of God, command that these stones become bread." Now, usually we focus on all three of the temptations. I'm really going to focus mostly on the first today. But we have to know that Lent has begun, and we've begun our 40-day journey with Christ to Jerusalem, where he's betrayed, falsely accused, beaten, and crucified. If you remember the week, I think it was the week before last, we had that passage where Jesus sets his face to go to Jerusalem and tells his disciples, oh, by the way, I'm going to be betrayed, falsely accused, beaten, and crucified. But don't worry, I'm going to rise again on the third day. And they didn't get it. So this is our Lenten journey. And we've received this mark, this sign of ashes upon our foreheads to mark something like a chosen desolation. Now, like all journeys, ours begins at the beginning, of course, not in the middle or an end, but in the beginning where Jesus comes out of the Jordan water, just before the reading that we have today, to the thunderous voice proclaiming from heaven, "This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased." And straight away, after this wonderful mountaintop experience, the Holy Spirit drives Jesus out into the wilderness, and there he fasts. So our Lenten discipline follows his. If our master fasts, we will fast. If he prays, we will pray. If he goes into the wilderness, we go into a wilderness of our own making. So this is a season of fasting. Now, I think for too long, the people of God, people in churches, have not really taken Lent very seriously. You know, we turn things purple here during the season, and we talk a little bit about fasting, and maybe we might skip a meat meal. But we don't do very, very much at all. So we don't take it very seriously, as if the Christian faith were merely a moral or theoretical proposition, one that required nothing other than a quiet assent of the intellect, but certainly not the active subjection of the body. Two very different things. So we go into the wilderness with Jesus fasting. Now, some manner of spiritual exercise is vital for the Christian life. We are supposed to be spiritual athletes. And we are not only denying the body by fasting, thereby giving strength to the spirit, but we are also gathering up for ourselves a spiritual and emotional experience by which we intentionally enter a certain sort of desolation, a chosen fast, a chosen desolation. That's what this period of time is meant to create for us. Something like going into the wilderness and choosing a certain kind of desolation. I'm going to talk more about that. And I know that desolation is a frightening word. Right? Just as Jesus fled, just when the disciples fled when Jesus was arrested in the garden, we want to flee. And your body will want to flee during Lent as well, during your fasting. Your flesh will want to escape as swiftly as a sparrow. So we need God's help. Now, Jesus doesn't flee from the wilderness, does he? But he's driven by the Spirit into it, as if the Spirit had taken him by the collar and dragged him there. The wilderness is desolate, we know this, and it's a sign of desolation. And so Jesus prays there, fasting for 40 days and 40 nights, adding hunger to silence and solitude to discomfort. There's no bed, no shelter, no amusement, no laughter, presumably, unless he's having a very amusing conversation with God. And after that time, it says he was hungry. Famished would be a better word. And there, as he experiences the pangs of true hunger at the limits of the body and the soul, That's when the devil comes to tempt him. And of course, this is often when the devil comes to tempt us too. Not when we're at our spiritual heights, but when we're exhausted, lonely, tired, hungry, and bored. Temptation is more than some devilish design to make you sin, but really to put you to the test. And this is what the devil comes to do to Jesus. There at the edge of human weakness, the devil comes to seize the opportunity to test him, to poke and prod until he discovers some sort of weakness to exploit. And this is what the devil does to each one of us. He comes to poke and prod and test, looking for this point of weakness where we can stumble and fall and come to ruin. Perhaps he's looking for a point of spiritual poverty, habitual weakness, maybe emotional trauma to exploit and make us fall from grace, to snatch the seed from our hearts like the crows that came and snatched the seed from the path, or to bake it in the sun of testing until it dies, like that seed that first came up with joy and then the sun baked it and it passed. Or like the seed that's choked with worries and cares. So here in this chosen desolation, Jesus is tempted by three temptations. The first is to satisfy his hunger, to meet his immediate physical needs by turning stones to bread. And the tempter is rebuffed by Jesus with, "Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes out of the mouth of God." Next, he's carried in the spirit to the pinnacle of the temple in Jerusalem, the highest point in the city, where the tempter urges him to cast off, trusting the promise that he shall give his angels charge over you, and they shall bear you up so you do not strike your foot on a stone. And then Jesus is taken up to a high mountain where the devil causes all the kingdoms that have ever been or will be to pass by in all their glory. And there he offers him dominion over them all on one condition, one little condition. Just bow down and worship me. Just this one time. A small momentary act for all of the kingdoms of the world. And of course, Jesus rebukes him harshly and commands him to flee, saying, "You shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve." So the Spirit has led Jesus into something we'll call the School of Desolation. And here we are with him. First, he's got to battle his own hunger in the wilderness for 40 days. This represents, of course, the common needs of the body. Deprivation is the first lesson. Deprived of the conveniences of life with its comforts and pleasures, Lenten disciplines pull back the curtain on our hearts. We see maybe how self-centered we are, how much the eternal soul is a slave to the body. And we know this because when we're deprived of these things, we might become a little bit more nasty or impatient or spiteful or unkind, maybe demanding. Maybe we find ourselves lashing out with bad words or an attitude where we become sour. It should cause us to reflect on how quickly we may abandon our ideals and profession. Bodily affliction that comes by sickness or imposed difficulties and unchosen suffering deprives us of freedom and energy too, agency as well. Our strength is diminished. Maybe we find that our freedom is restricted. Maybe we find that we can't do what we once did. Maybe you find yourself confined to a bed or limited in activity. Perhaps by age and advancing weakness or illness or an accident, we suffer in the body. And more, this could cause ultimately some sort of interior desolation. We may suffer the desolation that comes with the loss of a loved one, or marriage, or a job, or income. We may find ourselves in a drought, or a depression, or war. But the Christian does not flee these things, but endures them patiently. and the image of Christ is formed in us by submitting to the divine providence with holy resignation. In these desolations, the devil comes with a singular temptation: turn these stones to bread. And while we might imagine that Jesus could have done so at any point, I wonder if that sort of self-serving miracle was simply just not possible. Not because, as God, he couldn't do it. I'm sure that he could. But that he would not intentionally take up such self-serving power. To do so would have been tantamount to accepting the devilish temptation to seize dominion over the whole world. Because if you're going to begin to satisfy your needs at turning stones to bread, why are you going to stop there? Well, sometimes when we're in the school of desolation, we find that we cannot turn the stones to bread. And sometimes it seems like God will not do it for us. There are times that we've got to sit in our human frailty and incapacity and accept with resignation the circumstances that have befallen us. The reality is we want badly to change the stones to bread. We struggle and strive to change the conditions, but only find cold stones. No matter how much we struggle and rail against our circumstances, sometimes there's not a lot that we could do to change them. And if you're not careful, you'll take those cold stones into your own heart, and that will become cold and stony as well. This sort of desolation often leads to what St. John of the Cross called the dark night of the soul. This is an arid place where our senses, the spiritual organs that we know or experience God by, that have enjoyed any sense of God's nearness and love, are left desolate. This is when we find ourselves in that spiritual place where we've been praying and God seems distant. God doesn't seem to be speaking. We don't sense any nearness or sense of consolation. But it doesn't mean that God's not there. We may not be able to hear God's voice or discern his presence, but that doesn't mean that God has left us. It may simply mean that we're in the dark night of the soul. That whatever things that we've been experiencing, whatever desolations have come upon us, it is producing some state of desolation. Our prayers fall like stones to the ground, and our spiritual hunger is left unsatisfied. But John tells us that the dark night can break forth into a new dawn if we simply and humbly accept the conditions that we're in. And that's not always easy, especially when we're suffering, especially when things are hard, especially when there's loss or grief. The longer we try to turn the stones into bread, that is, the longer we reject whatever deprivation we've been experiencing, and the longer we try to fight it, the longer we resist the reality of it, the more silent God seems, and the more our desolation turns bitter, cleaving us from God until we sit in ashes and perpetual mourning. The souls that resist the grace found in humble resignation live in perpetual desolation until they choose to accept every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. And some of those words drive us out into the wilderness. This is a hard thing for us to hear. It's hard for us to go through. Sometimes we find ourselves crucified with Christ, pinned to the cross, nailed there, suffering. And we hear the voices saying, if you are the Son of God, take yourself down from that cross. And some of us do try. Some of us will rip our hands and feet off of that cross and walk around a bloody mess for years and years, when all the while we're supposed to remain there and be crucified so that something in us that must die does die, so that we can find a new resurrection. This first temptation can become for us a school of holy resignation. Here, as the comforts and pleasures and self-determination are taken from us, we've got to learn to draw new life like from a hidden spring out there in the wilderness. That's God. In the desert of deprivation, we learn holy resignation, where we resign ourselves to the providence of God. It's here, as the sun of adversity beats down on the seed sown, that we either drive roots deeper into God or fall away. And this is a crucial moment in the Christian life. What will you do? It's just like what I was talking about a couple of weeks ago with the trees that were growing out of the cleft of the rock, and how it seems so impossible that they can actually thrive there, eking out an existence, clinging to the side, the cliff face. But they did it. They did it because they were holding on to life, and that life is God. Of course, there are other desolations too, but we need to drive ourselves deep into the rock that's higher than us. The fact is that we can fall away in heart, all while we hold to the pretense of even attending church or show religious language. We've got to drive our roots deeper. And that's what this School of Desolation can teach us if we'll have it. Again, there are other desolations like those that the devil brought to Jesus, the desolation of religious pride or the deception of power. These carry their own interior state of desolation. But all these desolations, but in all of them, we know that God is ever present, even if momentarily God seems to be absent. Here, in the dark night of desolation, we are promised to drink from hidden springs if we will persevere, if we will wait, if we will accept with holy resignation the conditions that God has placed us in. Now, I know that there are some conditions that are outright bad, right? Doesn't mean that you're supposed to stay in truly harmful situations when you know you can move. For example, in the first few centuries when there were many persecutions, like the persecution of Diocletian, Christians were encouraged, go get out of the way. You don't have to go be, martyred if you don't have to. But some knew that that was their lot and resigned themselves to it. Anyway, here in the dark night of desolation, we're promised to drink from hidden springs. And God is a God who creates pools of water in the desert and springs that come up from the rock. And so it says in Psalm 84, it says, "Blessed is the man whose strength is in you, whose heart is set on pilgrimage. As they pass through the valley of Baca," which is the valley of tears, "they make it a spring." I'll say that again. As they pass through the valley of tears, they make it a spring. The rain also covers it with pools. They go from strength to strength. Each one appears before God in Zion. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen.